And so what I want to take a look at next is how do we select useful information to include as evidence? And then how do we talk about it? How do we integrate it into our writing? So let's take a look at this telemedicine topic and try to find some sources that would support my idea that increased access to healthcare is a primary benefit of telemedicine and that it does offer a solution to barriers that people experience when it comes to seeking good, equitable healthcare. So what we want to do next is to head back to the databases. Now, for your annotated bibliography, you found sources, and hopefully all of them will end up being useful for you in writing your paper. It's possible, though, that as you work, as your ideas really begin to take shape, that you might discover that one or two of them won't actually end up being used for your paper, and that is okay. It's a natural part of the researching, writing, thinking process to refine your choices and sometimes discover that you need new sources. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to use tons of information from each one. In fact, you might just use one fact from a source, one quotation, one little piece of information, and that would be okay. Part of the reason why I'm asking you to incorporate 5 sources in some way is so that you have diversified your research. You are not overly relying upon just a few sources for your information, because that doesn't make you the most credible writer if you're overly dependent upon just a couple of authors. That would call into question how well you know your subject matter. You want to show that you've conducted wider research, considered different perspectives, and have found more proof than just one article for your paper, for instance. And so I do ask that you have 5 sources total for your paper or more, and that you use 2 scholarly sources as a part of that 5. And so you will probably need to head back to the database to find another scholarly article. And I won't go through all of the steps involved in that again, but if at any point during your paper you're having trouble finding good sources, let me know and we can work together to find what you're looking for. But I want to just take a minute here to use this as an example of how would I start, taking a look at sources as far as what kind of information I know that I need from them. Previously, you've been finding sources, reading them, and discovering what's good about them. But now, as a researcher who's making their own argument, you might approach this in reverse. Through thinking about your argument, brainstorming your reasons for your opinion, you may have discovered that, I have an idea. If I'm going to prove it, I need to find this specific kind of information. And so your research is becoming more narrow. It is becoming more specific. So you're trying to find articles based upon the information that you already know you need to include in your paper. And so let's see what I can find when it comes to telemedicine and to access to healthcare, because I, as a writer, have decided that is one of the points I want to make in my paper. And so I need to find sources that are going to help me talk about that and prove that I'm right when I say that telemedicine does help increase access to healthcare, and that is something that is important because people experience barriers to good healthcare. So let's take a look at the databases. Now, there's a number I could choose from. I've recommended before that Academic Search Complete is usually a pretty good place to start, but we've got 92 databases, and what you might consider is based upon what your topic deals with, looking at the subjects menu and seeing if any of these specialized subjects fit with your topic. So obviously, health and medicine could be useful to me. And so you can see here that we have 16 databases that would help with a topic that falls under the category of health and medicine. And so these are the ones that the library recommends most. You can see that Academic Search Complete is still a database that's useful because it covers lots of different subject areas. So I'm going to go with Medline with full text. and use this database to search for scholarly journals in the field of health and medicine. Now I'm going to start first with a very general search, and I'm just going to start typing in telemedicine and see what comes up. All right, so it's suggesting some searches. Ooh, telemedicine in rural areas, telemedicine benefits. Those all sound like potentially useful things to the paragraph I'm working on, because if I think telemedicine increases access to healthcare, one of the things I already had in mind was, what about people who live in small towns that don't have access to, a lot of doctors or more advanced healthcare options? So let's actually go with that search and see what we find. All right, so we have 44 search results. Hopefully some of them might be useful. The first one that comes up is using telemedicine to treat opioid use disorder in rural areas. That could be interesting. I'm going to keep looking though. So primary care and obesity management in rural areas for older adults. Now, older adults, those are also people who sometimes might have problems accessing healthcare due to the ability to travel safely and to have the resources to travel. So I'm actually going to open that up and I might come to that one. So let's see if we have anything else, another elderly population article. So clearly that telemedicine is something that might offer a solution to barriers that elderly people, specifically in rural areas, experience. Now, because I keep seeing this come up, I might decide to do another search and say telemedicine and the elderly. And that might also be something that's worth looking at. So I've spent some time conducting research through a number of different search terms. I even tried some different databases, but I figured you didn't need to see all of that. But definitely making use of the library databases is helpful. And also Google Scholar, if you've used that previously in the semester, that might be a good place to approach as well. So I found an article here that looks perfect for my purposes. Use of telemedicine-based care for the aging and elderly, promises and pitfalls. And so this is a scholarly article. You can see the 3 authors here, Department of Family Medicine in a Polish university. And I took a look through it. It's about 16 pages here, not too bad. But of course, I have a handy abstract up front that can tell me if this article fit my interest before I dedicated my time to reading it. And as you can see, I've highlighted some things here that the article covers that are definitely applicable to the paragraph that I'm working on in my paper. So they say that telemedicine-based care provides remote health and social care to maintain people's autonomy and increase their quality of life. And they stress that one of the most important populations that benefits from telehealth are the elderly. And they explain that smart home systems allow older adults to live in the environment of their choice and protect them against institutionalization or placement in a nursing home. One of the benefits is that it gives the elderly person a feeling of reassurance and safety, and that telecare solutions give a new opportunity for diagnosis, treatment, education, and rehabilitation, and make it possible to monitor patients with a number of chronic diseases. It also reduces socioeconomic disparity with regard to access to care and gives equal chances to patients from urban and rural areas. So this is exactly what I'm looking for. It covers a population who might not always have equal access to healthcare, who very much need it. And so not only does it cover the elderly population, but it also specifically addresses patients from urban and rural areas. And so this article is going to help me address the idea that telemedicine is good because one of my reasons, it increases access to healthcare. But now that I have found my article, the question is, once I've read through it, I've highlighted some of the information I find the most interesting and applicable to my paper, how do I actually incorporate that information as supporting evidence in my argument? Well, we'll take a look here. Particular information from my source and then work it into a paragraph that still features my own thoughts. That is something that is key about this paper, that you are controlling the argument and then using information from sources merely to back up your points and to prove that, your reasons for your argument are valid and true. So out of a 16-page article or whatever it was, I ended up only pulling out 3 sections that I thought might be useful for my paper. And so just to give you a quick look at those, one interesting part for me was data that was gathered actually from Canada in 2011 that a lot of the elderly population live alone, a quarter, 24.6%. Women are twice as likely to live alone. And the authors pointed out that this could present a challenge for receiving medical care because if you live alone and perhaps because of a disability or health condition are unable to drive, that presents a real problem when you might need to go to the next town in a rural area to receive the health care you need. But when I look at this data, I'm like, okay, 2011, that's a little old. And so one thing I encourage you to do is even as you look over evidence from the articles that you might find useful, there will be times when you say to yourself, well, this is good, this could help me, but I need to find more recent data, or I need to see if somebody else says this for America, not Canada, because that's my focus, not that you have to be focused on America. So what I might tell myself is this bottom part is useful, that these doctors have pointed out how this is a challenge, a burden to receiving access to health care. But I might go find another source that hopefully gives me more recent data that still confirms this to be true. And in fact, I did. And I'll show you that in a little bit. Another section of this article that I had found useful was the explanation of how people living in rural areas face unique challenges to accessing care. And so they noted that many small but dispersed rural communities may only have 2 or 3 physicians and a handful of nurse practitioners, all of whom have full caseloads. It is often the case that rural healthcare patients in need of specialist attention must travel to larger urban areas. So as I already pointed out, that might be hard for people, especially elderly people living alone. And so not only living in a rural area do you have decreased access sometimes to specialized care or even, just regular appointments because these few doctors have so many people to take care of, you have that extra challenge if you need to travel outside of your community to get care. So this information is definitely something I can use in my paper to prove my point that telemedicine can increase access to healthcare for people who otherwise might not have it. And then finally, a little bit more information I found that proves that telemedicine does indeed benefit this population. And so these doctors found that patients with chronic diseases are usually discharged earlier from hospitals when they need to go, and that the amount and frequency of emergency calls and hospital readmissions has decreased considerably. And then they quote another researcher who found by studying a 6-month home telecare program for patients with particular disease, also saw a lower number of hospitalizations and nursing home visits, and also saved money for that group of people that were studied. And so this would help me prove that not only have I said there's a clear problem in access to healthcare for people, in a physical way, but that telemedicine can provide a solution that is proven to be beneficial. Now, trusting just one source for this is perhaps not enough. I would likely still want to conduct some more research to see what other positive results I could find as a result of people using telemedicine. So I did go ahead and conduct some further research, which I won't go through showing you. That's a lot of background detail. But at any rate, this is a body paragraph that I came up with as a result of my initial research and then some added sources that I found. And so I've highlighted in the paragraph the places where I am citing sources in which I am bringing in evidence, supporting evidence for my points. And then what is not highlighted are my words, my opinions, my interpretation of the data that I have found. And so you can see it's probably about 50-50, me and my citations. And that's probably a pretty good balance to have. Don't let your evidence overtake your paragraph so that it feels like just a list of citations. You want to make sure that you are providing context and reasoning and that you're explaining how this evidence actually helps to support your points. And so you start off with a topic sentence that, as we said, should represent one of the reasons why you think your thesis statement is true or right or good. So if my thesis for the whole paper is basically that telemedicine is good, more people should adopt it, more healthcare providers, insurance companies should support it, right? If that's my thesis, then I need reasons that I believe that is true. And so I set up a body paragraph that highlights one of those reasons. But I can't simply say, oh yeah, increased access to healthcare is one of the primary benefits of telemedicine, and then move on, because I need to prove to my reader that, well, that statement is true, that I'm not just making it up. And that's why we devote a whole body paragraph to one reason, right? And then we back it up with supporting evidence. So even before I get into my evidence, I still want to explain my position a bit more. And so why is access to healthcare important? And is there actually a problem that telemedicine would help solve? So this paragraph I actually devote to showing that there is difficulty for certain populations in accessing healthcare. Now, there are many actual healthcare issues. I could get into, a lot of other ones that aren't directly connected to my topic, and you want to avoid that. So always look back at your thesis statement. Always look back at your topic sentence. And so in this case, whatever I include has to either explain why there's a lack of access that telemedicine could solve potentially. And so here I say that healthcare should be equally available to all, but sadly that is not always the case. Geography, age, and a person's health in and of itself can prove a challenging barrier to receiving necessary diagnoses, treatment, monitoring, and follow-up appointments at traditional healthcare providers. So in these statements, I have shown that there does exist a problem, right? There is a lack of equitable access to healthcare. And when I say traditional healthcare providers, I mean physical places, right? Where you go to the doctors, you go to the hospital, whatever it might be. But I need to prove that. And so that's when I start bringing in my supporting evidence. And so here you do see some information from my original source, right? These doctors indicate that many rural communities may have a limited number of doctors, and patients who need specialized care are often forced to travel out of the area. Now, I didn't quote that source directly, but that information definitely came from that source, so I still need to cite it. I use a signal phrase that refers to the authors, and because it was a journal article with page numbers, I put the page in parentheses, right? But rather than moving immediately to my next piece of evidence, I still want to include some of my own words and reasoning. So then I think to myself, well, if people have to travel outside of rural communities, is that easy? Might there also be problems with access to transportation or ability to travel? Oh, that might also be another point in my argument that's worth talking about. So I say that travel can prove another burden for patients who are older and or have disabilities and chronic illnesses that might limit their mobility. And so I think that's a fair point, but my reader can't just take my word for it. I've got to prove it. And so what I found through my research was that this is particularly difficult for people in rural areas because, as I found out in a new source, because I decided, okay, I can't rely completely on one source, some of which their information is a little bit dated. And so I started looking at United States government websites that, draw information from census and other, studies they've conducted that are recent and are about, the population that I live in. So I found that this problem in accessing healthcare, that it's particularly difficult in rural areas because whereas 10.9% of the population of metropolitan areas have disabilities, the number is higher for rural populations at 16.5% in 2019. And then once again, I haven't quoted directly, but that those numbers definitely did not come out of my head. They come from a source, and the author of that source was the United States Department of Agriculture, a study that they had conducted. And so in parentheses, I cite the author. The author was not a person, but an organization. If you find any kind of .gov websites or even some .org websites, they typically won't have one person listed as an author, and you would cite whoever the organization or department is behind that. If you run into a source like that and you're not sure what to do, let me know and I will walk you through it. So I've added another piece of supporting evidence here. I am building a chain of reasoning. I am showing that there are multiple barriers for people to receive physical health care regularly. It might be because they live in a rural area that doesn't have enough doctors. It might be because travel options are limited to them because of chronic illnesses or mobility or age. And then I'm showing that that gets even worse when you live in a rural area and you have limited access to transportation for whatever reason. So if it's because of a disability, we see that the numbers show that more people with disabilities live in rural areas rather than metropolitan ones. I also found that rural areas have higher populations of people over 65. According to the most recent census data, rural populations are on average older than in other areas of the country. So all of these things are problems on their own. People who live in rural areas, people who have disabilities or other chronic illnesses that might make it difficult to get to a doctor, but throw all of these things together, you have transportation limitations, and you live in a rural area that demands that you might have to go elsewhere to get your care. Well, that's a very unique challenge. And so I conclude that, right? I take all of my data and I interpret it and I tell my reader what I think it means. This part is key. Always conclude your paragraph with thoughts from you that make sense of the evidence and try to persuade your reader of your point. And so I say that, wow, such living conditions present unique challenges that require new solutions. Bring it back to my thesis. When physical access to healthcare is not always easily accessible, telemedicine may be the answer. Now, that means that I still haven't talked about the benefits of telemedicine. I ended up spending this whole paragraph just proving that there was a problem that maybe could be helped by telemedicine. I have not yet proven that telemedicine will do anything to help the problem, so I need a whole new body paragraph to do that. So sometimes you might find that one subtopic in your paper, one reason for your argument, might need more than just one paragraph, in which case, write two. Maybe your paper is based on two primary reasons that your argument is good or right or important. And then you might take 4 or 5 paragraphs to say that. That's okay. As long as you feel that you've got good reasons, good supporting evidence, and that you're persuading your reader by including your own opinions and your own interpretations of the information that you find. So if I were to write another body paragraph, I would need a topic sentence that still connects back to my point, and I would need to pull in some new research. Now, I didn't bother to write a whole new paragraph for you guys, but I'll show you here, the basics of what this second paragraph for my reason number 1, I'm right about my thesis, would look like. So my thesis, or rather my topic sentence, would say, in recent studies of seniors in rural areas, a particularly at-risk population, we can see how telemedicine can be a great help. Now, that topic sentence tells you that I am going to show how telemedicine can be helpful. I've got to prove that now. So here's where I would want to pull in different evidence than my last paragraph. My previous paragraph, I proved there's a problem in need of a solution, specifically for people who live in rural areas and specifically elderly people in rural areas who likely have disabilities, comorbid conditions. They really are the most at risk. And so that is something that I proved in my previous paragraph, but now I need to prove that, well, telemedicine is actually a solution. So here in the body of my paper, I would provide some evidence. I would describe some of the, technologies used in telemedicine and their benefits, and I would want some data that shows positive results. So you remember earlier I showed some of the information that I found, and yeah, patients were often discharged earlier from the hospital, less frequent emergency calls, showed progress, saved money, but I also had thought at the time, well, I probably need more data than just that one source. So I would keep researching. And then by the end of that paragraph, if I've done a good job, I tell my reader how they should interpret my evidence. I tell them what they should think now. It's my job as a writer to present reasonable ideas for my thesis, back it up with evidence, and then conclude that evidence with a statement that is going to drive home whatever point it is that I'm trying to make. So in this case, I would say the challenges that elderly populations in rural areas face also represent barriers that younger Americans face, whether due to their locations or their health. So clearly, telemedicine can increase access to care for those who need it most. So it is vital that more healthcare providers adopt new technologies and ways of doing things if they want to offer more equitable, effective treatment for all patients. So my concluding sentence ties back to my topic sentence, but it also ties back to my overall thesis. With every paragraph you write, you want to remember, what is my thesis statement? What am I trying to convince my readers of? How's my paragraph done this through the evidence I've used? And how can I use my concluding sentences in a paragraph to drive that point home, to tell my reader what I want them to believe or do, right? That is the job of my paragraph. So you can think of it in some ways as a sandwich. Your topic sentence offers a reason for your thesis accuracy or value. You back it up with evidence, and then at the end of the paragraph, you really try to persuade your reader of the importance of the information in building your argument. So don't just list information from sources. You need to be the writer that is explaining the research to your reader, telling them what it proves and why it matters. That is your job as the persuasive writer of this paper. You do the research so they don't have to. You present the research in a way that is easy to understand, and you tell them what the research means for your argument, because ultimately it is your argument that you're trying to persuade someone of. So, sandwich paragraph, have control over the information. What that might look like, you don't have to follow this order exactly, but this is probably a good way to think of it. First, you have topic sentence. Then you explain or give context for your topic sentence. Then you start introducing some evidence from a source, but you want to set it up first, explain what you're going to be talking about. Then you quote or paraphrase the source, and then you explain what you just quoted or paraphrased. So you're always giving context and reasoning for whatever sources you're including. And then you repeat that step as needed, however much evidence you think you need, and then you conclude the paragraph. Never end on a quote, never end on a source. Always have your opinion, your interpretation at the end of the paragraph to really drive home whatever it is you're trying to prove to your reader. And so on the next page, there will be a handout on the next module page that offers you some examples of this strong body paragraph structure so that you can follow it as you're putting your paragraphs together. So key in using evidence, what I want you to really take away from this is that, yes, you need good evidence. You want to look at multiple sources to find supporting details, but remember that they're meant to be support. You're the one whose words should always start a paragraph and conclude a paragraph. Your job is to make an argument, provide your opinions, and simply back them up with evidence for the skeptical reader. Don't let your sources take over. Your job is no longer to summarize a whole source. Your job is not to talk about why the source is good or bad. Your job is simply to find information in your sources that help support your opinions and points.